and scholarship exams, either, in the very, very near future, because obviously the selective schools exam is coming up in just a few weeks, and people are, feeling a little bit stressed, or you're maybe thinking about doing a scholarship exam sometime this year or next year. Now, a lot of students, especially parents, have been very panicked because they don't know what the difference is between all these kinds of exams. Who here has heard of all these things like AAS and ACER and, all of these different kinds of exams floating around? And people are feeling a bit panicked about what the difference is between all of them, how are we meant to prepare, all that sort of thing. Today, I'm going to give you pretty much a high level overview of all the different kinds of exams, what you should expect from the English sections. I'm not going to talk too much about maths and GA because that's a different kind of specialty. I'm just going to focus on the English sections, which are often the most complicated anyway. I'm sure you all know how to do maths and you all know how to do GA. They're all the same kinds of exams across all three. It's the English sections in all these different kinds of exams that have the most differences and exhibit the most weirdness. So that's what's going to happen. Now, today's presentation, as we've already said, many of you are probably feeling incredibly overwhelmed. What do I have to do to prepare? What are the sorts of things I need to study? And how do I go into these exams feeling a bit more confident? Because each one of them seems so different. So the questions we'll be answering today are, well, firstly, what subjects are being examined in each exam? Secondly, what sorts of question types can we expect to see in the English comprehension sections for the different exams? Thirdly, what the difference between especially the AAS and ACER scholarship exams are, which schools run them. And then finally, we'll be doing more of a deep dive into the writing section. Now, the reading and writing sections for all of these exams are quite complicated, especially the writing section. That's where you're going to see the biggest difference from the three big types of exams, selective schools, AAS, and ACER. So we'll spend a bit more time, about half an hour on that, and then half an hour on everything else. And hopefully today I'll answer most of your burning questions from this presentation. But of course, if you have more questions, save them to the end, and I'll leave out about half an hour's worth of time, or maybe slightly more time, for all of you to ask your questions when you do want to ask them. Okay, so there'll be plenty of time at the end for you to put up your hand and pick my brain about anything in particular. Now, before we dive more into it, I can see some of my students here, but if you've never met me before, my name is Chewy. I'm one of the founders here at Cogito. I've been teaching English now for something like 8 years. I came first in New South Wales for English in the HSC, and since then I studied a law degree. I've also taught law at the University of Sydney last year and hopefully later this year as well. And I'm currently working as a lawyer. So that's just a little bit about myself before we get into it. Okay, so what subjects are in the selective schools, right? We're going to go over all the subjects because this has been a topic of much confusion to a lot of people, what the difference between all of these exams are. Now, the selective schools is the one that pretty much everyone here will be doing, right? I'm sure all of you will be doing it, even if not all of you are doing the scholarship exams. I think all of you will do the selective schools exam. Now, the selective schools exam is the one where we have the most definite idea of what's going to be in the exam, and that's because the government actually publishes, thankfully, all the numbers on their website, right? So from the government's website, we know there are going to be 4 sections in the selective schools exam. We have the reading comprehension section, which this year has increased from 30 questions to 38 questions. I'll talk a little bit about what's changed in a later slide. You also get a slight bump of time from 40 minutes to 45 minutes. You have a maths reasoning section, which is 35 questions in 40 minutes. You have a thinking skills section, which is sort of like GA. Everyone done thinking skills here before, right? Thinking skills in GA. So we all know what that is. That's like spatial reasoning, different kinds of pattern recognition, that sort of thing. That's 40 questions in 40 minutes. And finally, we have a writing section, which is only a single question in 30 minutes. In today's presentation, we're going to focus, of course, on the reading comprehension and writing sections of these respective exams. Now, as some of you already know, in recent years, most of these exams have been conducted digitally. Obviously, that's a good thing. I think that's overall a good thing. Why? Because, most of you are not doing that much handwriting. It's obviously very important, but most of you not doing that much handwriting. You're getting more used to the computer. A lot of students have also told me they feel like they can type faster than they can write by hand. Is that correct? So obviously that's helpful for the writing section. But as you all know, you're not to bring your own computer. Okay, so no bringing your own device and loading up ChatGPT in the background or doing any other dodgy stuff. Usually, this you go to a testing center and they provide you with a computer that you're able to use. So it's all conducted digitally. This often means the marking turnaround is a little bit faster as well, and it's obviously way more accurate than if a human being marked it. The writing section is, of course, still marked by a human being. Now, that's the overall subject. This is just at a very high level. Now, what happens to the other kinds of exams? Now, some of you may have heard of AAS before. Put up your hand if you've heard of AAS before. I'm sure your parents have talked about this or you've heard some tutors talk about this. Now, AAS is one of two independent companies in New South Wales, okay, that some schools hire to do their exams for them, right? So instead of the school having to write an exam, the company AAS, they write the exam and they administer the exam on behalf of the private schools. So it's also known as Academic Assessment Services. They're an independent company. Now, AAS is used by the majority or most of the private schools in New South Wales. So most of the famous ones anyway, right? So Knox, King's, Abbotsleigh, Pymble Ladies College, Barker, Winona, Merredin. There's like a list of 50 schools that use this. So most likely, if you're doing a scholarship exam, it's going to be an AAS exam. That's not every single one of them. There are a few exceptions, which we'll talk about in a second, but the majority of schools do use this AAS exam. Now, the key difference between the all scholarship exams, but in particular the AAS exam and the ASA and other kinds of exams, so the selective schools exam, is time pressure. Now, as you'll find in the selective schools exam, most students feel like they can finish the questions very quickly and have plenty of time left. Who here has done some selective schools practice exams before? Did everyone feel like you didn't really have much time pressure in those exams? I think most people would agree with that, right? I even have some students who say, hey, the reading exam, I have 40 minutes, but I can finish it in 20 minutes and then I have 20 minutes to check. Okay, so some students are really fast. Now, that is the complete opposite when it comes to scholarship exams. Scholarship exams, lots of students say they don't finish. As you can see, the number of minutes you have compared to the number of questions you have is much fewer. So, there are four subjects typically in AAS exams. You have a reading comprehension section, which is 45 to 50 minutes, so similar amount of time to selective schools, but you have a whopping 55 to 60 questions. Now, remember, in the selective schools exam, you only have 38 questions for 45 minutes. Here you have 55 to 60 questions. That's way more than one question per minute. Okay, it's something like, 1.2, 1.3 questions per minute. You have to go really quickly. This is also the true for mathematics, but especially true, and you're not going to believe this, for GA, right? So for GA, you have 45 to 50 minutes and you have a staggering 72 to 80 questions, okay? That is one question approximately every 30 or 45 seconds. That's really a lot of time pressure. So when it comes to especially the reading comprehension section for a AAS exam, really your job is speed, right? And how do you improve speed? We have to start implementing strategies like skim reading. Whereas for the selective schools exam, you have time to read every single word of every single passage very carefully. When it comes to an AAS exam, you don't really have that privilege. It's much more about getting through all the passages as quickly as you can, getting through the passages in as much detail as you can, and so on. So, when it comes to reading comprehension, AAS exams, that's what you should expect. Now, as you can see on this screen, I've put some ranges, right? 45 to 50 questions, 45 to 50 minutes, 55 to 60 questions. Well, why is this the case? This is because AAS actually tailors the exams to each school. So, for example, the Pimble exam is going to be slightly different from the King's exam, which is going to be slightly different from the Barker exam. It depends on what the school wants. So, there are no set number of questions, although they should be within this sort of range. Okay, so some schools might only have a 45-minute reading section. Some schools might have a longer 50-minute reading section, and so on. So, it does vary from school to school. And that's obviously because, AAS has thousands of questions and they generate a new exam for each school. That way, for example, if you've done the Abbottsley exam and then you do the Pimble exam, it's not going to be exactly the same exam for both schools. So they do change quite a bit and there's no set questions. But as I've said before, compared to the selective schools exam, there's way more questions and way more time pressure. That's the key difference when it comes to the AAS exam. Now, we have the third kind of exam, which is, of course, the ACER exam. Okay, put up your hand if you've heard of ACER as well. Now, ACER is the slightly rarer kind of exam, so not as many private schools use it, also known as the Australian Council for Educational Research. Okay, so it's another independent company, and it's used by some private schools, less than AAS. So some famous examples include Shaw, we all know Shaw School, Scots College, Skeggs Darlinghurst, and Croydon PLC. Now, there's a full list. Unlike AAS, ACER actually publishes a full list of all the schools that use the ACER exam. You can find it on their website. Now, here's the difference, okay? For ACER, there is no GA section. So some of you might be feeling really happy about that. Maybe you really dislike doing GA, but ACER exams have no GA section. For AAS and for selective schools, you have a separate thinking skills slash GA section where you do a lot of pattern reasoning. You do a lot of, different kinds of pattern recognition questions. That isn't present at all in the ACER exam. But here's the sting. Here's the trick. ACER exams have two writing sections. So whereas for AAS and for selective, you only have to write one piece. For ACER, you have to write two. Typically, that's one creative piece of writing and one personal reflection. We're going to talk about personal reflections later in this presentation when we talk about the writing section. But of course, don't worry too much about that. Okay. We're going to talk more about what each of those things involve. So similarly for the ACER exams, like the AAS exams, there's no set number of questions, but from our experience and from what we have seen, it's fairly similar ranges to this, to the AAS exams. Okay, so fairly similar amount of questions in the ACER exams as well, but they do vary from school to school. And generally, they have more time pressure, and they will be generally a bit harder than the selective schools exams. So key differences between AAS and ACER. There's no GA section, but there are two writing sections. Otherwise, the maths and the reading comprehension sections are very similar to what's in the AAS exam. Okay, now we have a very special one, Sydney Grammar. So this is just a boys' school, but one school in New South Wales famously has an internal exam, right? So what do we mean by internal exam is they set their own exam. Why? Because Sydney Grammar thinks they're really special. They like to set a super difficult exam. And they don't use either AAS or ACER. Now, Sydney Grammar is very similar to ACER, but it has a whopping 3 writing sections. So you thought the double writing section in AAS was in ACER was pretty tough. Well, if you're a boy and you want to go to the Sydney Grammar, you have to do 3 writing sections. So 3 pieces of writing at 25 minutes each. Now, typically, at least in the most recent year, that was 1 creative writing question, 1 personal reflection, and something else, right? So it could be, any of these other things like a report or a proposal or something like that. But in the most recent year, it was a news article. So 3 writing sections. Now, similar to ACER as well, Sydney Grammar has no special GA section, but generally, there might be some GA-like questions in the mathematics section, similar for ACER as well. So the main difference, okay, summarizing again, selective schools, that's the easiest. Lowest amount of questions, highest amount of time. AAS exams, very time pressured, and a killer GA section where you have 80 questions in like 50 minutes. That one's really tough. ACER exam, no GA section, but you have 2 writing. Sydney grammar exam, you have three writing. Oh, that one's going to be pretty difficult. All right, let's move on. So now that we know the overall summary, okay, the overall summary of all the subjects, well, what can we expect in the reading comprehension sections? Now, what I want to do first is I want to overview all the different kinds of things you might find in a reading comprehension exam. Now, then after we do all the kinds of things you might find, then we'll talk about what goes into each individual exam. So selective schools, AAS, and ASA. Now, generally speaking, there are, I would say, seven types of questions you're going to find in a reading comprehension exam. We have your very, very normal generic questions. Those are fiction extracts and non-fiction extracts. All of you have read these before. Fiction extract is obviously just a short story. It might be the first chapter of a novel. It might even just be one page from a novel. That's a fiction extract. A non-fiction extract is everything else. So it could be a biography of someone, an interview with someone. You might even read a lot of articles talking about scientific discoveries. Has everyone read those before? Yes, recent discoveries made, maybe even big news events. Those are fiction and non-fiction extracts. Those are your most typical or, ones that you've done. Probably hundreds of practice questions at this point on fiction and non-fiction extracts, if you've been doing tutoring for a while, right? Now, the next five types of questions are the slightly more special kinds of questions that aren't just your regular run-of-the-mill fiction and non-fiction extracts. The first special type of question appears most commonly in the selective schools. In the selective schools exam, you actually don't have any of these. Surprisingly, in the selective schools exam, you don't have regular fiction extracts and you don't have non-fiction extracts. What you do have is one of these. Okay, what's called a comparative article. A comparative article is where two articles are provided back to back. They usually be called text A and text B. They'll usually be on the same general topic, but they'll provide different points of view. So a really common way that these comparative articles are structured is you might be about a scientific theory, but it'll be two competing hypotheses. Has anyone read a comparative article like that before? Right? So it might be, one theory about something and then a more recent theory about something and they debate each other. Or it might be about a political idea and two different topics about that idea. So, very, very common way of structuring these comparative articles. Then you'll be asked questions about each article individually. So that'll have usually three questions on article A or text A, three questions on text B, and then two questions about the relationship between text A and text B. So the question might say something like, what would the author of text A say about the author of text B? What would the author of text B think about what the author in text A said in this paragraph, right? So it's going to ask you to think about the relationship between the texts. Now, sometimes the relationship between the two texts will be more abstract. So, for example, two stories that both explore the question or the topic of identity. Now, I know all of this is very, very abstract, so I would like to show you an example, and what better example to show you than directly from the selective schools. I'm sure all of you have already done these practice tests before, but for those of you who maybe aren't or are a bit younger, here is the most recently available selective schools exam on the website. Okay, this is sample paper 3. Anyone done this one already? I'm sure some of you have, yes? Okay, sample paper 3, exactly like I said, starts with text A, and then you have text B, right? Text A appears to be a fiction extract. The question actually tells you both of the articles are going to be about dogs and their relationship with humans. Then you have text B, which is a non-fiction extract. And then you have, as you can see, a few questions about text A, a few questions about text B, and some relationship questions, right? Some questions which ask you about, what are some connections and what are some differences between text A and text B. This is a comparative article, pretty straightforward stuff. Okay, then of course we also have poems. Now, poems, that's its own beast, but when it comes to poems, what I always like to tell students is don't worry too much about what the poem means. Okay, so a lot of students they become super panicked. Put up your hand if you've ever, done a practice exam, you've read the poem once or twice, and you have no idea what it's talking about. Okay, you have no idea what the author is talking about. You are completely confused. You think this isn't even English. This is some other kind of language that is pretending to be English. Now, when it comes to these poetry questions, my top tip for you is actually when you look at the questions they ask you, a lot of the questions don't need you to understand the poem as a whole. Okay? A lot of the questions will be very, very specific and very, very targeted. For example, the question might ask you, what poetic technique is being used here? Is it personification? Is it metaphor? Do you need to understand the whole poem in order to get that question correct? No, you don't. There might even be vocabulary questions. What does this word mean? Do you need to understand what the poem means in order to get that question correct? No, you don't. So often what you're going to find is out of six poetry questions, you still might be able to get four or five correct, even if you have absolutely no idea what the poem is about. So just focus on getting those individual questions correct instead of panicking when you realize, I have no idea what the poem is about. I'm a failure. Everything is doomed. It's the apocalypse. My job here is to get you to not panic, and poems are nothing to worry about, right? Once you answer 5 out of 6 questions, you'll be feeling a lot more confident, and then you'll be able to get that final question, which might ask you more specifically about, the poem's overall meaning or its theme. But don't panic just because you don't know the overall meaning or theme of a poem from the very first read or the second read. Okay, then we have three other special kinds of questions. We have closed text passages. We have vocabulary close, which is brand new this year for the selective schools, and I think also for AAS exams, they'll have vocabulary close. And then we also have matching text passages. Now, closed text passages, a lot of people's worst nightmare. Put up your hand if you despise closed text passages. I'm sure some of you do. A lot of hands going up. So, closed text passages are passages where the examiner has removed certain sentences from the text, and your job is to put them back in the right order. Now, closed text passages, unlike every other multiple choice question, and I can see some people who were part of my closed text intensive class this morning who heard all of this already, but closed text passages, unlike every other kind of multiple choice question, is really risky, right? Because if you get one question wrong, typically that means you get two questions wrong. If you get two questions wrong, typically that means you get three questions wrong, and then you get four questions wrong, and so on. Because closed text passages, every answer impacts every other answer. Put up your hand if you've ever gotten a closed text passage back. You thought you would get full marks, but you only got like two or 3 out of 6. It's a very, very common experience, and it's quite a risky kind of passage. So my tip for you is, of course, you need to be careful to not guess, right? Don't just guess a question, but really think logically and put the only answers down that you're sure of and come back to the ones that you're not sure of later instead of putting an answer down. Most closed text passages will often also contain what's called a red herring. So a red herring is basically just a fake answer that the examiner has made up to trick you. It doesn't belong in any space at all, and it was never part of the original passage. Now, I'm sure you don't need me to explain what a closed text passage is to you because I'm sure you've done lots of it. But just as a quick visual example, in the selective schools exam, the closed text passage, this is actually a slightly different kind of closed text passage called a summary passage, but very similar idea, right? As you can see, we have 7 answers and we only have 6 spots. So one of these doesn't go anywhere, and you can only use each answer once, which means if you get one question wrong, you're probably going to get a whole bunch wrong. So it's very, very important to be accurate. Next up is a kind of similar kind of question. Now, it's also called close, but it's nothing really like these. So very confusing naming. So it's called vocabulary close, but it's not really like a big closed text passage. A vocabulary close is where individual words have been removed from a few paragraphs of text, and you have a multiple choice A, B, C, D, and you have to pick the best vocabulary word to go into each of those spaces. Now, unlike a big closed text passage, a vocabulary closed passage is a lot easier. Why? Because you can guess. It's just A, B, C, D again. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. It doesn't mean when you get one question wrong, you're going to get six wrong all of a sudden, and then you're going to cry when you get your marks, right? Vocabulary closed, you can guess. It is just 25% chance of getting it right. It is just a regular multiple choice question. Now, vocabulary closes, yes, you're missing individual words, but they often also test your grammar in very clever ways. So it's not just about how good your vocabulary is, but also your grammar. Let's have a look at an example. Now, we actually don't have any official examples from the selective schools exam because they haven't published any yet, but I do have one here that I can show everyone. I think this was from a past, hang on. I think this was from a past exam that was used by a scholarship school. Okay, so, oh, where did that go? Oh, here we go. So this is what a vocabulary closed text passage looks like. So similar to a regular closed text passage, you have gaps missing. But unlike a regular closed text passage, hallelujah, just a regular A, B, C, D question. Okay, so a lot simpler than all the sort of little shenanigans you have to pull for a big closed text passage. And as you can see, your job is basically to pick what you think is the most appropriate word to put in the space. Now, despite its name as well, vocabulary closed text passages typically don't contain vocabulary that is really difficult. Now, can everyone look at these, all of these words here? Would people agree that they know most of these words already? Like there are not that many words here that they've never seen before, right? Put your hand up if you agree. Yeah, I think so. Right? So for most of these words, I would say the majority of students have seen all of them already. It's not like maybe in your thinking skills or in your reading comprehension section, you might get vocabulary words that you've never seen before in your entire life. And you're like, oh, I've never seen this word. It's such a complicated word. That's not what this section is actually testing. So the best way, how do you get better at these sorts of sections? Well, this section is actually testing your understanding and your familiarity with English, right? So it's not asking you to know what all of these words mean. It's really asking you which one is the most appropriate to be using in an individual space. How do you get better at this? Now, unfortunately, if you're doing your selective exam in a few weeks, you probably don't have time to get amazing at this. But for those of you who might be doing it next year, or you might be even younger, the best way of improving at this kind of question is by, like any other thing in English, reading many different books, especially reading news articles and reading different kinds of more advanced novels. Because ultimately, what this is testing is, am I comfortable with written English? Do I know, for example, what the most appropriate word would be? For example, let's look at question number 1 here. The addition of what's called a leap second is something to allow the Earth's rotation, right? Now, if we look at the options that are available, designed, targeted, framed, and drafted, most of them have kind of a similar-ish meaning, but some of these would just not be appropriate, right? Is drafted? Well, drafted's usually for writing, isn't it, right? Frames typically, for a painting or some other sort of thing. Is targeted to allow? That seems a bit strange. It's not something you would use, but it's designed to allow the Earth's rotation. Means, someone created this thing for the purpose of fulfilling some sort of scientific goal, right? So design works in there very well. So the vocabulary section, the vocabulary closed section, as you can see, is not really about throwing very, very complicated words at you, but it's really about knowing if you understand which word is the most appropriate for these spaces. Okay, and that's really the key challenge or the central challenge. Okay. Finally, we have some people, this is their favorite kind of passage. Some people, it's their least favorite kind of passage. But we have what's called the matching text passage. Okay, so the matching text passage is where you're given four or five, sometimes even six small extracts. So typically they're between 1 and 2 paragraphs long. They're not usually any longer than that. Paragraph long extracts, and you'll basically be asked to pick the right extract where something is mentioned. Now, the key mistake and the key risk for these kinds of questions is students don't predict how precise, right? How precise the question actually is. Right? So most students they will make a lot of mistakes in this section because they'll pick an extract which is vaguely related to the question. But really, as I've said to my students probably hundreds of times, if you've come to my class, you'll have heard this tip before. What the question is actually asking you for is an exact paraphrase of the question, right? So you almost have to be able to highlight or underline the exact words in which the question is mentioned. It's not about matching, oh, vaguely, this extract B is sort of talking about this. That's not going to cut it. You definitely get the question wrong if you do it in that way. So, as always, I want to give you a visual example so we all know what we're talking about. Let's jump back to our classic selective schools exam. And usually, right at the very bottom, you'll see the matching text passage, right? So, as you can see here, you're given four extracts. Okay, they're 3 paragraphs long, but they're pretty short paragraphs. They usually won't be longer than this. And you'll have some examples of questions, right? So, for example, which writer is a research scientist? Okay, so you have to find the writer who is actually talking about themselves as a research scientist, right? So, which one of these is going to be that? Well, you need to be able to find someone who talks about themselves as that. For example, it seems like maybe the person in D is a research scientist because they're working at the Center for Rehabilitation and Assistive Technology at Vanderbilt University. Okay, so they're doing research, right? So that's the sort of level of detail that we probably need. Yeah. You have to be able to find and underline or highlight the sort of exact part of the paragraph which matches up with the question. Okay, so those are the general kinds of question types you're going to find in a reading comprehension exam. Those are all the different kinds. There might be more types. New ones are being introduced every year. And obviously, I can't foresee and jump into the future and tell you what they are, but don't be surprised if they have other kinds of questions coming up. So other ones that we've seen before, we've sort of seen other people do before, include where certain texts are kind of mixed up or in different orders and you have to rearrange them into the right order, something like that. So that might be, kind of very similar in concept to a closed text passage. You might see some of those other kinds of questions as well in your AAS scholarship exam. Now that we're familiar with all the reading comprehension question types, well, what's in each of the exams? Now, in the selective schools, there are a whopping 5 kinds of questions. So, selective schools has the widest kind of range of questions. Selective schools always go in this kind of order. Sometimes we don't know where the vocabulary clues will be placed in the exam because we haven't seen one yet. So it could be after the comparative article or it could be after the poem. So we don't know, but it will be somewhere in the exam. And you have 5 different kinds of questions. You have a comparative article, which is made up of 8 questions. You have a vocabulary close, which is made up of 8 questions. You have a poem, which is made up of 6 questions, a close extract, which is made up of 6 questions, and a matching text passage, which is made up of 10 questions. Now, very confusingly, has anyone read the government website for selective schools before? Okay, very confusingly, they don't say they have 38 questions in the exam. They say they have 17 questions. Anyone seen that before? It's a very, very bizarre way of them describing it. But basically, they think of this question, and this question as one question each. But each of those questions are worth 8, 6, and 10 marks, respectively. I don't know why they describe it like that, but they say there's only 17 questions in the exam. There aren't, there are 38 questions. Now, one thing that I want to draw your particular attention to. a lot of students are going to find that they're able to do section 2, section 4, and section 5 very quickly. For those of you who have done vocabulary close questions and matching text passages, put up your hand if you find you can do these in like 3 minutes. You can do these like super quickly. Anyone have that experience? Yes? Some people are even very good at closed text passages and say they can do closed text passages in like 3 minutes. Now, here's the thing that I want you to pay attention to, right? Most students, I agree, will be able to do especially 2 and 5 very quickly. But just because you can do it very quickly doesn't mean that you should. Why? Because look at how many marks these questions are worth, right? Your vocabulary close is worth 8 marks, right? So that tiny little thing where you have to fill in 8 vocabulary words is worth exactly the same amount of marks as the article where you have to read 2 articles and answer 8 questions. So a lot of students, just because it's easy, they will rush through section 2 and they'll lose a lot of marks in section 2 because they rush through it just because they can. And they'll rush through section 5 and that's worth a whopping 10 marks, right? That's even more than a comparative article. So please make sure you are timing yourself based on the number of marks in the exam and not rushing through, especially sections 2 and section 5. Because those are worth a big amount of marks, right? Can you believe it? The vocabulary section is worth more than the poem. And lots of students spend the most time on the poem because they're so confused by it. So don't rush through this, okay? This is worth a lot of marks. So it's in your best interest to consider every question very carefully. Same with the matching text passage because it's worth 10. Every question carefully, giving it the amount of time it deserves. Not rushing through anything. That's my top tip. Now, as I said, yes, most students make the most amount of mistakes in parts 2, 4, and 5. So those are the ones you want to pay the most attention to, okay? All right, so that's selective. It's got the widest range, but the good thing about selective is that you have very little time pressure. As you can see, there are 38 questions, but you have 45 minutes to do it. Most students, I would say, find that they finish the exam in 25 to 30 minutes. Okay, so most students should have anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes to check. Okay, maybe even longer, 20 to 15 to 20 minutes to check. Now, please use your checking time, especially for the selective schools exam, just because you don't have that much time pressure. So you do actually have time to kind of go over the questions more than once. Now, that's what's in the selective schools exam. What about the reading section for the scholarship exams? Now, for AAS and ACER exams, a little bit different. Now, generally speaking, the AAS exam has a lot more regular fiction and non-fiction articles, right? As you can see in the selective schools exam, we don't have any normal fiction and non-fiction articles. We just have the comparative article. The AAS exam, you're likely to get the long, bulky fiction and non-fiction extracts that you've read before. Now, remember, the scholarship exams, the biggest challenge is time pressure. Right? So when you combine time pressure with a lot of these regular fiction and non-fiction articles, that's where some students struggle and they panic and they run out of time. So when it comes to AAS and ACER exams, what's your best friend? You must skim read. Okay? You must remember to skim read, not skimp read, skim read. Because the article's longer and you have more of them, skim reading is your best friend. Now, generally, as I said, you should expect more regular fiction and non-fiction articles. Typically, there are more non-fiction articles than fiction articles. Okay? Generally, there's more non-fiction articles. This year, AAS also are starting to use vocabulary close passages. So very similar to the selective schools exam that has included vocabulary close. You should expect to see a vocabulary close question as well in your AAS exam. And they can include any of these other kinds of things, although generally speaking, there's less of them. There's less range than in the selective schools exam, right? In the selective schools exam, you're guaranteed 5 different kinds of questions. In the AAS exam, you're guaranteed at least these 3 Plus, there could be these other things as well, depending from school to school. So basically, you don't have to prepare any differently for the reading exam when it comes to the selective and the AAS. You prepare in exactly the same way by doing as many different kinds of questions as possible, right? So for those of you who are worried about, do I have to do something special to prepare for AAS and ASA? Not really, other than practicing your time pressure, right? That's the main thing. The kinds of questions are going to be pretty similar between ASA and selective and all the exams. The main thing is, can you actually do 60 questions in 45 minutes? If you can't, then that's going to be a bit challenging for you. Now, the ASA exams, very similar to the AS exams, except they don't usually have closed text passages. So those of you who really hate closed text passages and you're doing an ASTA exam, they typically don't have closed text passages. We haven't seen one in a number of years. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed not to have one, but usually there aren't any in ASTA exams. Okay, and that's the reading section when it comes to selective and scholarship. Now let's talk about writing, our last big section. Now, the writing sections, here's where it gets really annoying, but also really interesting. In the writing exams, unfortunately, the bad news is in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've seen this happen as a teacher, the writing sections have become significantly harder. They're making them harder every single year, unfortunately. But they're not necessarily making them harder by giving you some sort of crazy question that you can never answer, some sort of insane stimulus. They're making it harder by giving you different kinds of questions you might not expect, formats you might not expect. Okay, Oliver, Alice, Felix, if you keep putting your hand up and down, I'll just remove you from the presentation. It's very simple, okay? Unless you have something you want to ask, some sort of emergency, don't use the raise hand function. Okay, so they've become significantly more challenging in recent years. Why? Because you're given many, many different kinds of formats, and especially for the selective school, there's no guarantee anymore. They just call it a writing section. Gone are the days where you go into a selective schools exam and you know you're going to write a story. There's no guarantee. You might be the best story writer in the world, and you get into the selective schools exam and they say, please write a news article. Or you might be the best news article writer in the world, and you get into the selective schools exam and they go, please write me a story. Right? So the problem is there's no guarantee, especially for the selective schools exam. And in fact, every single selective schools exam since they changed the exam about 5 years ago has been different. There has never been a repeated kind of question in 5 years. Okay? So it's completely unpredictable. Now, just because something is unpredictable doesn't mean we can't prepare for it. It just means we have to prepare even harder for it and put even more work in. Now, the ASA and the AS exams, they're actually easier, technically, than the selective schools, right? Because the selective schools, completely random. Who knows what it's going to be? The AS and the ASA exams, you're guaranteed to write one story, right? So at least one of the pieces is going to be a story. The AS exam, it's a story. The ASA exam, it's a story and a personal reflection. Olivia, do you have a question? Oh, okay. So, in many ways, the scholarship exams are a bit more predictable, right? We know what they're going to be. They're going to ask you to write a story. Some of them might ask you to write something else. It's really the selective schools exam that's a bit of a wild card. Now, I have some general tips for everyone about how to approach the exams, but before we do that, let's have a look at some of these recent questions. Okay, so the 2024 question said, imagine the date is July 19th, 2099. Write a diary entry of someone your own age who is living in the future. Use the sentence below to start your diary. Dear diary, when a house robot woke me up with its loud singing, I remembered that. Now, this is a kind of a weird question that tricked a lot of people because what is this actually asking you to write? Anyone? This is really asking you to write a story, isn't it? Right? It's really creative writing, except it's done in a diary entry format. Okay, so this is creative writing. But the year before, it was a news article in Selective. There's no, rhyme or reason to this, right? And guess what? The year before that, It was a proposal. They call it an advice sheet, right? Three new students have just arrived in your local area. Your teacher has asked you to write an advice sheet for them, making them feel enthusiastic about coming to your school. Write an advice sheet for the new students about how to get on well in your school and your local area. It's kind of like a proposal. So, as you can see, and also, yes, the 2025 question, which is actually not up on the website, that asks you to write the opening to a short story, or write an opening. Again, that was a creative writing, but it was completely different kind of creative writing than this, right? So every single question so far has been completely different. Now, my top tips. Firstly, especially for the selective schools, don't panic. A lot of students, when they see a question type they've never seen before, they panic. They don't know what they're doing. Okay. They start writing straight away because they're like, oh, I can't waste time. I can't waste time. And they end up producing something really poor. Now, remember for selective schools, writing especially, you have 30 minutes, right? For scholarship exams, you only have 25. Very sad. Sometimes you get 30. But for the selective schools, you are guaranteed 30 minutes. 30 minutes means you have at least a couple of minutes at the start, even up to 5 minutes, where you can do what? Slow down and think about it, right? Slow down and plan it. So the first tip for any kind of writing is don't panic, right? A lot of students will rush into writing in an exam, even if they're encountered by, a difficult question they've never seen before. So, for example, this question here, right? Writing the diary entry. It's July 2099. A lot of students panicked when they first saw this question, and guess what? They kind of just wrote like a news report. They had no story at all. They just said, the year is 2099. We have robots now, and blah blah blah, right? I have flying cars, and my washing machine does this, etc. Not a very good response to this question. Okay, so don't panic. Think about what it's actually asking you to do first. Whoops. Um, so read the question carefully. What are you being asked to write? Is it a story or not? Right? Is it a story or not? What skills do you have to apply? Do you have to write in any of these kinds of ways, right? Are you being asked to write persuasively? Are you being asked to write creatively? Are you being asked to write informatively? So you need to figure out all these questions before you begin, especially for the selective when you have 30 minutes. You have a bit of extra time to plan. And no matter what you write, you have to stick to a structure. Now, obviously, for stories, you have less of a structure, right? It's more free form. But anything that is not a story, you need to have some kind of structure, right? A lot of students, they panic when they write something that they've never been asked to write before. Some students even end up writing a lot of their stuff in dot points. Who's done that before? Written in dot points for something, right? Now, that might be appropriate in some places, but for an exam, that's not appropriate at all. So you must stick to a structure. And by a structure, we mean try to use an introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion structure, right? Just like a regular essay. Stick to a structure, no matter what you're writing. Unless, of course, you're writing a story. A lot of marks in these exams are assigned to how well your writing is structured. If you don't structure your writing at all, you are guaranteed only at best like a 65 or a 70. I'm not even kidding. Okay? Structure is a huge part of these exams. So make sure you have a clear structure when you start. Now let's tackle some of the more common formats. The first format that a lot of students have to are confused about is creative, right? So, firstly, especially for the selective schools exam, how can you tell if you're being asked to write a story? How can you tell? Well, creative writing will usually give you a stimulus to work from, right? A stimulus is some sort of fictional, it's usually a picture or a sentence, right? If it asks you, for example, to start your text with a sentence or start your text with something, it's probably going to be a story, right? Because, why would they ask you to, for example, to write a report, but they force you your first sentence to be a certain sentence? It's usually if they're giving you a stimulus to work from that gives you creative ideas, it's going to be a creative text. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself, do I have to make up a narrative, right? So, do I need characters? Do I need emotions? Do I need goals? Right? All of these things are only really relevant for creative writing. They're not relevant for any other kind of writing. So, for example, the one about the diary entry, right? The house robot. Do I need a character? Well, yeah, I need my main character. Do I need to describe their emotions? Do they need to have goals and aspirations in this diary of theirs? Sure. That's very, very different to simply writing a news article where you just say, hey, this is what happened. These are the people that are there, etc. So, characters, emotions, and goals. These are all the relevant parts. So the 2024 question, the one that we just looked at about the robot, that's an example of a very unconventional creative text, right? Lots of students saw diary entry and they didn't see creative, right? They saw diary entry, they didn't think I'm writing a story. But really, when you think about that question, you're being expected to tell a story, right? My house robot woke me up with its singing. How could that be the start of a news article or a report or something like that? Doesn't really make sense, right? So, yes, diary entry. Now, the key tip I have for you is no matter what the question is, you have to try to tell a complete narrative, right? One of the biggest mistakes that students make is they have a really good vocabulary, and what they do is they write 500 words of, and I have a special term for this now that I made up, description slop. Description slop. What's description slop? It's 500 words of where the student just writes something like, ah, the zephyr drifted gently through the trees. Ah, the azure blue sky shone onto my face, causing me to feel radiant inside. And a single tear rolled down my cheek like a crystal dropping into the ocean. Like 500 words of that. Unfortunately, that doesn't do well. That's very, very bad. Okay, so most students who try to write a description slop in the exam, they do very poorly. Even if you have amazing vocabulary, hey, you're a walking thesaurus, no one has ever had vocabulary more impressive than you. Unfortunately, that still doesn't make for a good story. So generally, the best creative pieces always have a complete narrative, right? That means they have some kind of character development, right? They have some kind of reflection from the character. The character undergoes some sort of process or some sort of challenge. There's a complete narrative. So please, no description slop, okay? No more just writing 500 words of, and then I dreamed I was walking through a door and light was shining through the door and all this sort of nonsense, okay? Generally, yes, okay, it might sound very beautiful, but performs very poorly in exams from our experience. Okay, so when we say complete narrative, that means you have these sorts of ideas, right? Somewhere in your story. Of course, it doesn't have to be this structure, right? You can mix around the structure. For example, some students they will take the climax and they will put it right at the very start, okay? And then they'll follow that with the orientation, etc. But you need to have generally the elements of a narrative arc in your story. How do we make the story even better? Secondly, you have to ensure that the stimulus is always the main idea or the focus of your narrative. That's another really common mistake, right? Students, they basically they don't use the stimulus particularly well. They only reference it right at the very start, or it just becomes a sort of background element. Generally, you have to make sure the stimulus is your main idea, right? It's the main focus of your narrative. Okay, and finally, how do we make our stories even better than that? Make sure your character basically has some sort of internal struggle or internal complication, some sort of emotional challenge that they're facing. Students of mine in my writing class, I'm sure you're tired of hearing the words internal struggle. They probably sound like nails on a chalkboard to you after hearing it 1 billion times from my mouth, but for some of you, this might be a new concept. Okay, I can see Esther is very tired of hearing about internal struggles. Kimmy, etc. But yes, right? Having an internal struggle means your character is facing some kind of emotional challenge or emotional difficulty. That's actually what allows for character development and your characters to become more mature over time. And finally, one more cherry on top. Stories can always be improved with more figurative language. Okay, so these are things like metaphors, personifications, similes, and so on. Right. Now, Apologies, I have a bit of a cold. Now, sometimes, and in recent years, the test has tried to throw a curveball at you, right? What we mean by curveball is the test has tried to trick you. And it's tried to trick you by forcing you to take some sort of weird direction for your story. Now, I'll give you two examples, right? As I told you, the 2025 selective schools question asked you to write the opening for a story. That's literally what it said. Based on this picture, write the opening of a story. What did some students do? They just wrote a really long orientation. Fortunately, that's the question trying to trap you or trick you, right? Remember, the tip I'm giving you is you should always have a complete narrative arc. So, how do we do that when the question only asks us to write the opening of a story? Well, has anyone read any book before? Right? Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, okay? Yes, there's an overall story, but each story is made up of tiny little narratives, isn't it? Think about Harry Potter, the very first Harry Potter book. It starts in London, right? It starts when Harry is living with the Foster family. I forget their names. And the first arc of that whole novel is Harry getting to Hogwarts, isn't it? Right? So that's almost like an individual standalone story inside the bigger story, right? Even though the whole story of Harry Potter spans 7 books, there are many, many, many smaller stories that make up that longer story. So when you're asked to write the opening of a story, it's a trap or it's a trick to just say, all I have to do is write an orientation. I'll just write 500 words of environmental description. I'll write 7 different metaphors about how beautiful the trees and the water are in my character's environment. Unfortunately, that's what some students did, and they did very poorly, right? So when you're asked to write an opening for a story, what that means is you're kind of just writing the first chapter, right? Something is still going to happen in the first chapter, and the character still has to deal with some kind of challenge, and they might even learn something about themselves from that first chapter. Because, for example, Harry Potter, by the time he gets to Hogwarts, right, he's already changed, right? He's gone through some pretty significant things. But it just foreshadows that further events will happen. Okay, so you still need a complete narrative, right? But you foreshadow that more events are to come, right? That's really the opening of a story. You don't just write a very, very long orientation. Now, an example from the scholarship world. Some recent scholarship exams have thrown a curveball, and the scholarship exams have supernatural, spooky elements, houses, ghosts, or spirits. Again, if you're in my class, you're probably tired of hearing me talking about this. But students who've done very poorly, they've interpreted this literally and they've written a horror story. I'm being chased by a werewolf. I'm being chased by a ghost. And then suddenly the axe came down on my head. There was blood everywhere. And I felt everything go black. The end. Guess what? 60 out of 100, right? That's what you get if you do something like that, right? Please don't fall into the trap. These are questions designed to trick the most common student. So if you see a supernatural element like a spooky house or a ghost or a spirit, remember, you don't have to write about them literally. Okay? You can always use those things metaphorically, right? For example, what's another thing? What does a ghost represent? Something from the past, something that's no longer here. Okay. In fact, we have many phrases in our English about memories being treated like ghosts, right? Oh, her memory haunts me like a ghost, and the memory of this haunts me. So use it metaphorically. Try to come up with a more realistic and a better storyline that doesn't involve being chased by a werewolf or a vampire and then everything going black. Now, other than the creative writing section, as I've already foreshadowed, right, you might be asked to write all sorts of other kinds of things in the selective schools. Okay, so you could be asked to write any of these things: proposals, reports, reviews, application letters, news articles, personal reflections, letters, and emails. Generally, these are the categories, right? In the selective schools, you've been asked to write a news article and a proposal. And remember, in ACER exams, as well as in the Sydney Grammar exam, You've been asked to write personal reflections as well as news articles. Now, we do not have time tonight, as you can see from the time it already is, to go through every single one of these. But I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the personal reflection because that is part of the AAS exam and it's also part of the Sydney Grammar exam. So, yes, we have a lot of other slides we could talk about, like news articles and that sort of thing. But I did want to talk about what a personal reflection is because this is guaranteed basically to be in a most of your scholarship exams. Now, a lot of students get really hung up on personal reflections, right? Personal reflection questions sound like, what does happiness mean to you? Who has had the greatest impact on your life and why? If you could pick one person to have dinner with throughout history, who would it be? Or, that sort of thing. That's a personal reflection. Now, a lot of students, they think these questions are very, and I hate this word, cringe. Okay, they say, I don't like writing these. They feel so cringe, right? I don't want to write about myself. I don't want to write about who has had the greatest impact of my life. That is so cringe. Unfortunately, how do you get marks for personal reflections? You get marks by being quote unquote cringe, right? Because what personal reflections are, they're very similar to persuasive essays. But your job is not to persuade the reader that you're correct, right? Because, for example, if the person who's had the greatest impact on your life is your mum, it's not as if the reader is reading it and goes, yes, I agree. The person who has the greatest impact on my life is Chewy's mum, right? That would make no sense, okay? It's really about you showing to the reader that you believe something, right? You have a very strong belief and you have the life experience to back up that belief, right? So it's not about having the correct answer. It's not about saying, compared to a regular persuasive essay, that school uniform should be banned, for example. That's where you want to sound correct, right? You want to sound like you have the better stance. But a personal reflection is not about having the correct answer. Rather, you need to explain why you believe in your own answer, right? So if you're going to say, my mom has had the greatest impact on my life, why? Right? Give me a good reason why, or good reasons why. You need to convince the reader, not by convincing them that Chewy's mom is the best, but that you believe that your mom is the best, right? You need to come across as sincere. Everyone know the word sincere? We've all heard that word before. You need to come off as sincere and genuine, right? So if you can show yourself as sincere and genuine, usually you'll do very well. Now, personal reflections basically are all about anecdotal evidence, right? In a regular persuasive essay, we're not allowed to use anecdotal evidence. That means evidence from our own life, stories from our own life. But in personal reflections, we are using almost entirely anecdotal evidence, right? You can't use statistics to prove that your mum is the best. You can't say I've done a study of every single mum in the world, and my mum is at least 3% better than every other mum. And this was conducted by the CSIRO, right? It doesn't really make any sense. Most of the evidence you're presenting is anecdotal evidence. So that's evidence from your own life. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean things that have happened to you, but it could be things that you've seen, things that you've read, things that you've experienced, okay, or other people's lives, right? For example, some people might talk about things that have happened throughout history that have inspired them. Well, I wasn't around, for example, during the Renaissance, unless any of you think I'm 500 years old, right? But I might, for example, find certain things that happened in the Renaissance quite inspiring and relevant to my life. And I can still use that as anecdotal evidence, right? So those are personal reflections. Now, yes, if I had 5 hours to do this presentation, I would talk about every single alternative format, but I'm guessing a lot of you don't want to be here till 2 a.m. But the most important one at the very least, the one that's guaranteed basically to be done in the AAS exam is the personal reflection. So it's really, really worthwhile practicing some of these. Now, one final slide and a couple of final examples to show you. What are the most common mistakes when it comes to persuasive writing and alternative formats? Here's some of the things I want you to guys to avoid, and we've kind of already covered a lot of these ideas already. For persuasive writing, the most common mistake is you don't have a clear structure, right? So we've already talked about that. A lot of students, whoa, a lot of students will get marked down for not having a clear structure. Okay, so they'll basically be writing in all sorts of different paragraphs. They won't have a clear introduction. They won't have clear body paragraphs. You get you lose a lot of marks. Some students also don't write the correct format. So you need to think very carefully about what it is you're being asked to write. For example, we did a practice test here at Cogito recently where students were asked to write a review, okay, a review of a book to contribute to a newsletter about underrated books. And I would say about half the class wrote a news article because they saw the word newsletter. They wrote a news article about a newsletter being introduced to the school. There was also about 20% of the class that wrote a review of the newsletter rather than a review of the book to include in the newsletter, right? So if you don't write in the correct format, you're guaranteed at most like a 60. Yeah, there's no way you can get above 60 if you just write the complete wrong thing. Third big mistake, a lot of students write arguments that are too assertive, right? Now, what does it mean to be assertive? Assertive means you write something without explaining why. Now, this is especially true when you focus too much on how good something is rather than why it's good, right? For example, let's say you got the question, really simple question that school uniforms should be banned, right? If I came yelling at you, I said, school uniforms should be banned. It's so great. It's so amazing. Wow, school uniforms being banned. The whole world's going to become better. It's so amazing. You're probably not going to believe me, right? Because that's very assertive. All you're doing is telling me how good something is, but you're not explaining why. So make sure that for everything you say in any persuasive writing or alternative format, you're justifying it with evidence. You're justifying it with an explanation. Fourth, not having the correct tone. Generally speaking, I would say the majority of things that you write should be formal, right? There's very, very little exceptions where you should be including any kind of slang or informal writing. I think most of the time you're much safer writing formally. Some students often make a mistake. They write too informally. They include a lot of language, colloquial language or slang, and that can lose them a lot of marks because maybe the marker doesn't think you're doing it deliberately, right? They think that's actually how you write. So generally speaking, just write formally. Don't write informally. Right? Unless the question specifically says, write a really casual letter to your friend, but I've never seen that happen. So always write formally. And then finally, writing off topic or providing irrelevant information, but that's obvious. Most common mistakes for students make for creative writing are one, they don't use the stimulus as their main idea. Okay, that's pretty obvious. If you don't do that, again, you're guaranteed like 65, 60. You can't really get higher than that if you don't use the stimulus properly. Okay, writing stories or events, character actions that are logical. So characters that do things that don't make any sense. Uh, we've already talked about this one, description slop. Okay, writing a story that is too abstract, containing only vague descriptions and emotions. And then finally, a key one, students who rely on too much dialogue, right? Way too much dialogue. Dialogue is very, very inefficient writing. Now, thankfully for all of you, I have a few examples to share. So let's have a quick look at some of these mistakes happening in action so that you know exactly what we're talking about. Okay, here's an example of description slop. This story, I think, got, I don't know, maybe 50, 55. Okay, as we can see, it's just description. As adrenaline raced through his body, James slung his backpack over his shoulders and ran into the forest. The cold spring breeze sailed through the forest as leaves danced across the path. The wind gave James a welcoming kiss as leaves twirled in idyllic spirals. Shrubs covered the forest, forming pictures of art on the ground like an experienced artist. His body was filled with happiness and excitement. A smile spread across his face. James trudged through the trees and shrubs like an iceman walking through the snow. Birds chirped like aunties at a tea party. Trees sung as leaves danced under the gentle sun. The blue sky streamed stretched upon endless lands of the unknown. What has happened? Nothing has happened. Okay, it just keeps going on and on. Everyone sort of see what I mean? Wow, James was curled in vines of happiness as his worries faded. It was like a paradise of endless freedom and fun. He stopped at the foot of a towering oak tree, its roots stretched to the soil like vines on a wall. Wow, James marveled in awe. Ah, it just keeps going. As you can see, this story has no narrative. It's just description. It's just emotions. This story, I think, got us maybe a 55 or a 60. Okay? So pretty poor stuff. Okay? Let's look at another one. This is an example of a story that uses way too much dialogue. Now, this story is a lot longer. It's almost 500 words long, so it's pretty long, right? But guess what? Look at the dialogue and how slow it makes the story, how boring it makes it. Heather, why were you late today? Oh, yeah, I was just helping out my family in the bakery, I lied. You don't even own a bakery. Poppy paused for a moment. Is it about your mother again? Yes. Heather, I'm sorry to say this, but you need to move on. That was over 3 years ago. All of a sudden, a sharp ringing sound came. Class dismissed. You are free to go home. Ah, more dialogue. Heather, why are you running? Poppy, hey, come sit with me, I cried. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, Heather, I'm sorry about what I said before. It's fine. You see that branch over there? Yeah, it's like a barrier. You can't get over it, so you're stuck there. Dot, dot, dot. You need to get over it to move on in life. You can't do this forever. You're right, I do need to move on. That's the spirit. Wow. Okay, so dialogue is very bad. We need to avoid as much dialogue as possible. Now, of course, you might be thinking to yourself, Chewy, that makes no sense. Okay, I've read books like Harry Potter where there's like 10,000 lines of dialogue. True, but Harry Potter is like 10,000 pages long. You have one page, right? You have one page. You cannot afford to be using so much dialogue in your story because it really junks up your story. Everyone sort of see what I mean? Fills your story with a lot of junk words like dot dot dot, yes, oh yeah, I was just helping. Like all this sort of stuff, very boring. So try to avoid using so much dialogue. That's another key problem that a lot of students do. Okay, let's look at one more example. Okay, this is an example of a story where the student has written very illogical things. Okay, so the character doesn't behave in a very logical way. Okay, as vehicles passed noisily overhead, Jackson was glad he was reaching his destination on foot. Okay. Jackson's fingers fumbled around in his pockets looking for his bronze compass. Clink, clink, clink. He pulled it out as bits of rubbish floated along with it. He's ruffled his hair, messed up as if it was a bird's nest in his hair. His bare feet trampled the soft sand that had blanketed his feet with every step he walked. Right? So then we go on. Okay, he gently combed his hair. His cat was called Dog, and it was the last gift given him from his father before he sadly passed away. You know, treasured the cat named Dog, and then he was looking for some sort of capsule, right? Um, you know, I don't even know what he's talking about here, right? Then Jackson remembered he had left Dog on the sand, and then he tried to fish his cat out, and then he was looking at his bronze compass, okay, something like that, right? I've got no idea. This story is a complete mess, right? So here is just an example of someone who's filled up their story with a lot of really illogical, strange events, characters behaving in strange ways. Don't do this. Okay, another really common mistake. Someone said, this is quite good. No, it's not quite good. If you wrote this, I'd give you a 65, okay? So please don't do this. I don't agree. I don't think this is quite good at all. I disagree heavily. Okay. Someone said this is decent. Guys, have higher standards for yourselves. This is not decent. This is a 65 story. We can do better than this. Okay? Don't say, as long as I write that good, it'll be fine. No, it's not just decent, it's pretty bad. Okay? We can do better. Now, I wanted to show you one example of persuasive writing, poorly done persuasive writing as well. Okay, so here is an example of a bit of persuasive writing which doesn't have a very good structure, right? So every primary school student should play after school sports. Okay, we can see that each of the paragraphs is not structured very well at all. Why? It doesn't have a clear topic sentence. It's very assertive. One of the most obvious reasons why children should play after school sports is physical activity can improve the overall health of a child and can also help them get stronger and grow taller. In addition to this, it can also reduce the likelihood of getting diabetes, Furthermore, sports don't only improve a child's performance, it also helps them inside the classroom. Sports can also help children focus on their own work and process information more quickly. So basically, this student has stuffed 7 arguments into one paragraph with no structure at all, right? Completely asserted without explaining why. So this is actually, you might look at these examples and think these are ridiculous. They're way overblown. I would never write something as poorly as this. Unfortunately, these are real students, okay, who have done trial exams with us, students who typically do very well. These are quite common mistakes. Okay, now a lot of you might be thinking, okay, Chewy, you've just shown me 4 shocking bits of work. Can you please show me something good? How do I know what's good? Okay, well, we can look at a story that actually got full marks, right? So this student got full marks. This was the story they wrote for our trials here. And then they went on to get a scholarship at a girls' school. And they also got high enough to get into James Roos and, all the selective schools. Okay, so this is an example of a student who did really well. There's actually 2 slides to this, right? Now, this student, I think this was like a 40-minute writing task. So it's a little bit longer than you would usually get, but they did write this in 40 minutes. Now, obviously, in a scholarship exam and a selective exam, you only have 25 or 30 minutes. So it'll be slightly shorter than what you see here, but it's still the same quality. They did actually do this in 40 minutes. Okay, so let's read this. Another bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. Swiping at his clammy cheeks with the grime-stained sleeve of his jacket, Ming tugged absent-mindedly at the thread spouting from a loose seam. Preoccupied as he was with his coat, he didn't notice the arched tree root that caught his shoe and sent him flying into the loamy dirt. As he scrabbled around in the mulch for his glasses under clumps of leaf litter and squelchy grey moss, he didn't even try to suppress the sigh that rose within him. Just over a month ago, he had been weaving through market stalls packed with wandering tourists with his classmates, no, friends, folding paper airplanes and playing at pilots racing through the skies. Just over a month ago, he had been feasting on the pineapple cakes and soothing tea his mother had always laid out on the table of their humble apartment. Just over a month ago, he had been home under a radiant red flag embellished with gold stars. Now he was here, drenched in the miserable humid weather of peak Australian summer, stranded amidst a dense prison of vegetation. Ming had seen forests in China before, near towers of long spindly green, threaded with sinewy bamboo that blanketed the long expanse of mountain ranges. The rainforests in Australia couldn't even begin to live up to that, not with their haphazard cluttering of shrubs, the trees and leaves bursting out from every surface. A dense canopy loomed ominously over the belly of the forest, only letting through brief splatters of sunshine that were quickly smothered by the broadleaf plants underneath. It was messy, different, unwelcoming. To make things worse, this forest was one filled with raucous classmates. Having summoned the strength to push himself off the ground, Ming glanced warily at the groups of classmates giggling amongst themselves, eyes darting to meet his, before the whispering grew even more vigorous. As he drifted over to the group, he steeled his nerves and braced himself for the pity and distaste sure to be lingering in their eyes. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the floor, trying to pretend he hadn't just severely embarrassed himself in front of all his new classmates. Ming, are you all right? That fall looks super painful. Cocking his head upwards, he stared puzzledly at a boy whose name he couldn't quite recall, fell into pace beside him, while another girl peered at his knees for scrapes or bruises. He was lucky the ground had been soft after the rain. He managed to gather from an animated explanation, nodding where he hoped was appropriate. She didn't seem to mind, though, eagerly herding him along with the group as they continued on their expedition to the lookout. It was nice, he thought. He'd expected the worst before the events had even occurred, assuming all his peers would steer clear of him because of his accent, because he was new, different. Ever since they'd moved to Australia, he dreaded interacting with others because it seemed so evident how much he stuck out, like a soft baby panda in a bone-dry desert. Okay? Funny simile there, but we'll move on. But in spite of all these things, he realized his classmates were still smiling and laughing with him instead of at him. For the small kindness they'd shown, Ming felt himself shyly grinning along, the tips of his ears flushing scarlet as they marched along the path. A few hundred wooden steps later, brighter sun finally began to peek through the thinning foliage. The sight invigorated him, invigorated them all, and Ming was swept along in a surge of bodies as the class burst past lines of unfurling vines and leaning trees through the part where he was met with blue, rich blue flooded his senses as he gazed, and so on. Okay, so then obviously he just, comes across a new scene. And finally, we come to the conclusion. Ming could not help but smile as the pure, untouched serenity of the Australian rainforest soothed some of the agitation within him. It no longer seemed to matter if he was a foreigner, nor if his classmates beside him had been born here. In this moment, they were all simply children in awe of the land beneath them. It would be a while, Ming knew, before his heart would be fully able to accept this strange new country as his home, but perhaps if there was any place in the world that could thaw it out, it would be under the persistent Australian sun. Now, another good piece of news, this was written before the invention of ChatGPT, so it's actually not AI generated, right? Which is always a risk these days. Now, some of you ask, well, what makes this story so good? Okay, what makes it get 4 marks? What made this person get a scholarship to Pymble Ladies College and then be able to get go get into James Roos and things like that? Well, firstly, like I said, this is a bit longer. This is about 25%, 30% longer than your story would be. So don't worry too much about the length. But what can we tell? Now, firstly, what do we notice? Does this person have like incredible vocabulary? Do they have like earth-shattering vocabulary, words that you've never seen before? No, they actually don't, right? They're using words that are pretty much everyone here would mostly know. But they're actually putting a lot of detail into their descriptions, okay? So it's not just about using the most complicated words you know, but they have a lot of nice detail, right? Especially this opening section, the orientation. What can we see? Right? The orientation paints a really vivid picture of the environment, right? We have no doubt we can really see the environment. The second thing that's done really well in this story is that the story focuses on the internal struggle of the main character, Ming, right? What can we tell about Ming? He's obviously a Chinese immigrant. Okay, he's just moved to Australia and he's not feeling like he fits in. So it focuses on a really unique challenge, right? A lot of the stories that I read are about getting chased by werewolves, getting chased by bears, trying to escape a bushfire, or going to a new school for the first time, or running a race, or doing homework or something, right? This is actually quite a creative angle to be writing a story about, a unique problem. And as the story goes along, the character behaves in a realistic, logical way, right? The way they feel, the way they think, it's all realistic and very logical. And as we can see, there's clear character development at the end. It's nothing dramatic. It's not like Ming says at the end, I am no longer Chinese. I have become Australian or something ridiculous like that, right? But there is a kind of subtle kind of character development as the story goes along, where we can see the character becoming, more and more comfortable in their environment. Right? So that's what makes this story so good. This story got 4 marks. 100 out of 100 is very rare. Obviously, at Cogito, we have pretty high standards, but we think that, marking to high standards really pushes students to get better results. And that's why every year at Cogito, we have so many students who end up getting scholarships and so many students who end up going to selective schools because we have very high standards here, especially in our advanced class. Okay, that wraps up all the content in our presentation. Now, yes, even though we skipped a few things, I am 25 minutes over time. I do apologize about that, but hopefully people were still getting some useful things out of that by the end. Now, of course, I promised I would save a little bit of time for